Hello and welcome to the mental illness iceberg. If you aren't familiar with the concept of an iceberg, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a few mental illnesses, and as we progress, they're going to get more and more obscure. I've made this list myself from things I've learned in my psychology degree so far and things I have read online. I've made it so that even in tier 1, it is going to be fairly obscure, so you might have heard of some of these before, but you might not know exactly what they are. So without further ado, let's get into it with tier 1. The first 3 entries on this list will be personality disorders. They can be kind of hard to talk about because unlike something like a mood disorder, which is saying like you have a maladaptive emotion, personality disorders can be kind of more personal, in which you're kind of saying like who someone is problematic or bad. I just want to quickly clarify that if you have a personality disorder of any kind, it doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad person, because at the end of the day, it's your actions that define you way more than, whatever, you've been diagnosed with. Hysterical personality disorder. This disorder is characterized by intense attention-seeking behavior and emotionality. People with this disorder will go to extreme lengths to be the center of attention. So these are your type of people that, would wear white to someone else's wedding or, do a crazy vocal run when they're singing happy birthday. A lot of the time, people with this disorder will also be diagnosed with some other disorder. This is mainly because hysterical personality disorder shares a lot of similar traits to something like narcissism. People with this disorder typically will have very loud and dramatic and volatile emotions, in which 1 second they're singing and dancing and then the next they're on the floor crying, like trying to get people to come over and comfort them. People with this disorder are usually very, very flirtatious and will often make sexual remarks at inappropriate times, whether that be at work or with a stranger they don't know. They are also very, very easily persuaded to do things and don't really have much of a sense of identity. Treatment for this condition is generally some form of talk therapy, in which they learn to regulate their emotions better, as well as learn some coping mechanisms and identify when it is an appropriate time for them to be the center of attention and when it's not. Skitsoid personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a chronic lack of interest in social interaction. It typically affects around 2 to 3% of the population and is slightly more common in men. It also varies quite a lot in severity, where sometimes it might just be like they feel quite uncomfortable talking to people, where others it's just like, I hate all forms of social interactions and please, for the love of God, stay away from me. They often come across as quite rude or dismissive. This is mainly because they don't really care what people think of them. For example, like they don't respond either to praise or criticism. They often have quite muted emotions, with often not experiencing extremes in either happiness or sadness. I'm probably not going to spend too much time talking about this one, mainly because, there's just not that much to talk about. They're loners, but they're kind of happy being loners, and if it's not really affecting other people and they're content with how they're living their lives, like who really cares? Like who are you to tell them that they're living life wrong? Schizotypal personality disorder. This is the last personality disorder I'm going to be talking about on the iceberg. People with schizotypal personality disorder are quite similar to people with schizoid personality disorder in the fact that they struggle to form relationships with people. But unlike schizoid personality disorder, they have a deep desire for closeness. People with this disorder have quite eccentric and strange beliefs. They often believe some form of outlandish conspiracy theory, such as the earth is flat, the moon isn't real, the CIA killed John F. Kennedy, which, they definitely did that shit. This disorder differs from schizophrenia because in schizophrenia, people will not be able to listen to opposing evidence to their beliefs, while someone with schizotypal personality disorder will be able to consider opposing evidence. Like, for example, do you believe the CIA has killed a sitting president? And I would say, yes. Yes, I do. Schizotypal personality disorder, which I do not have, affects roughly around 4% of the population, and usually can be treated through some form of talk therapies or training in developing social skills. And sometimes when the beliefs start kind of crossing over into the realm of delusion, they may be prescribed antipsychotic medications. In the case of schizotypal personality disorder, treatment really should be tailored to the specific individual. You could probably say that for pretty much every mental illness, because no two people are alike, and some of them will respond better to some things, while some will respond better to other things. Dissociative identity disorder, or DID. This condition used to formerly be known as multiple personality disorder and refers to when 2 or more personalities inhabit the same person. The disorder results from experiencing some form of trauma and can only be developed in childhood. It's actually surprisingly way more common than you think it would be, with around 1 to 1.5% of the population experiencing it. The reason why it's higher than you think it would be is because it is often misdiagnosed. This is mainly because it shares a lot of symptoms with an anxiety disorder or some kind of substance use disorder. And so when a patient comes in with DID, they're often given the wrong diagnosis. It's very heavily stigmatized. This is mainly because in media, alters are generally shown as quite violent and erratic. Like, for example, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, or the movie Split, which came out slightly more recently. They're always, some kind of monster that's inside of them. Needless to say, this is not true. People with the disorder, pretty much like any mental disorder, are far more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators. People with the condition are fully capable of leading productive and fulfilling lives. And honestly, I think it's just better to view this as just one of the flavors of humanity that makes people more interesting. Tier 2, Todd syndrome, or more commonly known as Alice in Wonderland syndrome, is a condition in which your visual perceptions are distorted. For example, things will appear usually much larger or smaller than they actually are. This differs from delusions, as people are normally acutely aware of what is real and what is fake, and usually originates from some kind of disease that is limiting blood flow to the areas of the brain that are responsible for visual processing. People experiencing the condition will usually report quite trippy delusions. They'll often say that people around them are either moving in fast forward or in slow motion, and they'll feel like they'll be able to stretch out their arm and touch a wall that's multiple meters away from them. The condition is quite rare and the symptoms are often fleeting, which makes it quite difficult to study. However, people who suffer from migraines have around a 15 to 20% chance of experiencing Alice in Wonderland syndrome. This is interesting because the author of Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, actually reported experiencing really severe migraines, as well as some types of visual distortions. It's unconfirmed whether or not he actually had the syndrome, but it is a kind of cool idea that the guy who actually wrote Alice in Wonderland and inspired the name for the syndrome also had it. Prospagnosia. Prospagnosia, or facial blindness, is kind of what it sounds like. You lack the ability to recognize faces. Like Alice in Wonderland syndrome, this condition is more neurological than psychological. We have an area in our brain called the fusiform face area, and what this does is it's responsible for processing facial information. So when this area is damaged, either through some form of injury or disease, or some people are just even born with their area not functioning properly, we will then lack the ability to recognize faces. Because it is a physiological thing, there isn't really a cure for it. People just kind of learn to adapt by recognizing people through either their hair or their clothes. Interesting enough though, you can still process emotions because that's actually a different part of the brain. So even though you can't recognize the face, you can still kind of tell if someone's happy, sad, mad, or, disgusted. The condition roughly affects around 2 to 3% of the population. And actually, interesting enough, there are a few celebrities that have it. For example, Brad Pitt has reported his difficulties and how he suspects he's got the condition, as well as someone like Stephen Fry. If you think you've got it, you can actually do some online tests. Obviously, this is not a professional diagnosis, but you can, it might give you an idea if you want to seek a diagnosis later down the line. Alien hand syndrome. Alien hand syndrome refers to when you lose voluntary control over one or both of your hands. The condition usually develops after some form of damage occurs to the brain, most commonly seen in people who have had strokes. Damage to several parts of the brain can cause it, and depending on where the damage is, the symptoms will vary. In some cases, people will just be grabbing things at random, while in other cases, it will be deliberately undoing something you've just done. For example, like if I open a cupboard, the hand will reach out and close it. Or if I'm making a bed, the other hand will be there unmaking the bed, which would be the most frustrating thing in the world. This condition is incredibly rare and its exact prevalence is unknown. People who do experience it will generally report that symptoms kind of cease after a year, but if they don't, you're going to probably have it for the rest of your life. Treatment depends on which area of the brain was affected. In some, pretty much all of them require some form of retraining of the affected hand. This condition I find quite interesting because it's one of those conditions in which we view it as just like an interesting phenomenon now. But I could see like someone in the Middle Ages developing this, and all of a sudden everyone thinks that they're possessed by a demon. And I can almost guarantee that at some point in human history, someone has been killed because of this condition and someone else thinking they are possessed. The Truman Show Delusion. The Truman Show Delusion is what it sounds like. It is the belief that you are the main character in a staged TV show and everyone around you is either an actor or following some kind of script. The Truman Show Delusion is not a specific disorder itself, it is more so a symptom of other delusional disorders like schizophrenia. It's unclear about how this condition develops. Usually though, the patient will have some kind of concerns about free will or the inability to know for certain that what we are experiencing is real. This one is quite interesting because it is unique to a modern context. People have been delusional since the dawn of time. However, this one could only possibly have existed in the last couple of decades. And it's only kind of now that just random people can just so quickly become a spectacle for, millions of others, which is why this delusion has only really popped up since the early 2000s with the rise of things like reality TV and social media. Hysterical blindness. This is probably my favorite entry on the list. Hysterical blindness is an outdated term for what we now call a conversion disorder. A conversion disorder refers to when psychological phenomena start appearing as physical symptoms. Simply to make this easier, I will still be referring to it as hysterical blindness. I just want to kind of make it known that I know that this is the improper term before someone yells at me in the comments. People experiencing hysterical blindness, despite nothing being wrong with them physically, have the inability to see. However, it would probably be more accurate to say they have no perception of sight, because their eyes still work. Like if you shine a light in them, you can see their pupils dilate. You can also throw a ball at them and they'll flinch, which is crazy because to their knowledge, they cannot see. So this kind of says a lot about how the mind works and how that there is a lot of this processing that happens subconsciously outside of conscious thought. Yeah, a lot of these reports are a bit sketchy, mainly because they're so old. A lot of them came from World War I and World War II, which is why it's called hysterical blindness. It comes from a time in which, mental illness was viewed as a weakness of character, which is awful. Imagine just surviving, trench warfare, and there's some doctor over you, looking oh, you're being hysterical, that's why you can't see. We've made a lot of progress in the last 100 years regarding mental health. However, despite these findings being old, they do make a lot of sense. We already know that a lot of what is processed happens subconsciously. It's quite hard to research this condition now because a lot of the times these periods of blindness are episodic, and it is incredibly rare for someone to have complete blindness. The majority of the time they just have blurred vision, so there is some form of perception. So testing something like someone's reflex or pupil dilation is quite hard because unless they have complete blindness, we can't really understand how perception of sight impacts, how sight is processed physically. Delusionary Parasytosis. A person with this condition has the irrational belief that under their skin lives a colony of parasites. There are two types of delusionary parasitosis. In primary, the condition appears on its own, while in secondary, it usually results from some kind of underlying condition. This is usually something like schizophrenia or some types of substance use disorder. This condition should be treated really quickly because the people with it are quite dangerous to themselves. Because a lot of the time, they'll do something in order to get rid of the bugs, such as drinking insecticide, which, to my knowledge, is quite bad for you. The problem is, because it is the delusion, people with it don't realize that there is something wrong with them psychologically, which means that they're not going to go see a psychologist. They're going to go see either a doctor or even their local gardening store in which they can find a way to kill these bugs. The main way this is treated is through some type of antipsychotic medication or some type of talk therapy that focuses on teaching them to differentiate between what is real and what isn't. Tier 3. Munchousins by proxy. Munchousins by proxy is a controversial entry with a lot of people arguing that it shouldn't be classified as a mental illness. Someone with Munchousins will pretend that they are either sick or injured in an attempt to garner sympathy and support from other people, while people with Munchousins by proxy will pretend that someone else is sick or injured, or in some cases make them sick or injured in an attempt to garner sympathy from others. The reason why this one is so controversial is because it is one of the only mental disorders that requires you to be committing a crime. This is because in order to effectively convince someone that they are either sick or injured, you're going to have either like a caretaker role over that person or some kind of power imbalance. Munchousins by proxy got pushed into the cultural zeitgeist with the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, who, if you don't know, when she was young, her mother would convince her that she had all of these things wrong with her. For instance, she scratched her knee one time, and as a result, her mum insisted that she needed a wheelchair, and she insisted that she needed a feeding tube to eat, even though she was capable of eating perfectly fine. It even got to the point in which she had some of her teeth removed to make her appear more sick. In the end, Gypsy Rose conspired with someone she met online, and they both killed her mother and went to jail as a result. And recently, Gypsy Rose has been freed from prison. In the DSM, Munchousins by proxy goes by a different name. It's called factitious disorder imposed on another. It's quite hard to know the exact prevalence of this one because it is a crime, and because of that, it is very infrequently reported. Capgrass Syndrome. People with Capgrass Syndrome have the delusional belief that someone they know has been replaced by an imposter. Early on, it was believed to only affect women. However, this has been proven to be untrue, and it can affect anyone of any gender. This condition is quite rare and quite hard to research, which is why it doesn't have its own definition in the DSM-5. However, it is classified under other forms of delusional disorders. The syndrome was first diagnosed by Joseph Capgrass in 1923, and it is often viewed in conjunction with other mental disorders. For example, the first woman to ever be diagnosed with the disorder believed that she was famous and from royal blood, as well as she had 3 of her children die, which she thought they had been abducted. And her last child that was still alive, she believed had been replaced by an imposter. The idea that a loved one has been replaced by some kind of imposter does predate the existence of the syndrome, with a lot of folklore talking about something like this. For example, in German folklore, they have the idea of the doppelganger, and in Native American folklore, they have the idea of the skinwalker. It can't be known for certain if these traditions have been inspired by Capgrass syndrome. There's just no written evidence supporting that idea, as well as the condition is just so rare that it's quite unlikely. This is quite a rare condition, with it only affecting around 13% of 1% of the population. Fun fact, they actually tried to diagnose me with the condition at one point after I shot the skinwalker disguised as my mother. Pika. Pika refers to the condition in which someone has the compulsion to eat inedible items. This usually takes on the form of something like ice, but can be more harmful with things like soil, sand, and bricks. The condition gets its name from the Eurasian magpie, which is often referred to as the Pika Pika, and it is famous for eating things that are not food. People with this disorder don't prefer the taste of inedible items. It's more so that they like the texture and the sensation they get from chewing it. Because of this, it is most common in children and people with autism spectrum disorder. So when I was a kid, I used to love to eat paper, and I think the reason for this was because someone told me you shouldn't eat paper, and I interpret that as you couldn't eat paper. So I believe that I was the only person in the world that was physically able to digest paper. And because of this, I would secretly munch on pieces of paper because it would make me feel cool, because I was like, I am the only one who can do this. Yeah, I don't know when I figured it out that, it's not that you can't eat paper, it's that the fact that you shouldn't eat paper. And I often wonder, I wonder if that's the reason I am like I am, maybe I just poison myself through all the bleaching agents and stuff. Anyway, regardless, Pika is usually curable through talk therapies and counseling. And it is fairly common, with around 1% of the adult population experiencing it and around 3 to 5% of children aged 5 to 7. Side note, I actually remember like a few years back, this kind of was talked about somewhat frequently because there was a TLC show called My Strange Addiction. And I just remember all these YouTubers just like pointing and laughing at these people who were like, you know, drinking gasoline and like eating bricks. And like, I remember laughing too, but like kind of in hindsight, I'm like, did no one think to just like stop these people? Like they're just like actively poisoning themselves with a very obvious mental condition. And we're just like, ha ha ha, isn't that funny? Erottomania. Erottomania is probably one of the scarier entries we have on this list. It's the delusion that someone you don't know has an undying love for you. Usually the target of someone's fixation is a celebrity of some kind or someone of higher status. Usually they've never met this person at all, and the belief is just completely unfounded. Although it's hard to tell if this condition is increasing, it definitely is becoming more noticeable, especially through the rise of, you know, social media like YouTube, Twitch, and things like that. If you've been lurking around YouTube as long as I am, you might remember who Christina Grimmie was. She was someone that recorded videos of her singing and like posting them to YouTube, kind of like old school Justin Bieber. She also was like a contestant on The Voice. The reason I bring this up is because one of her fans who had developed an obsession with her waited for her outside of one of her shows and ended up shooting and killing her. So I know I've been kind of lighthearted about a lot of the entries on this list, but I think for this one I'm gonna have a bit more of a serious tone. It's just like, it's a very deeply sad one, and real life people have been hurt quite significantly as a result of it. Luckily, it is quite rare. It's not common enough to have its own diagnosis in the DSM and is usually classified under other types of delusional disorders. But with the rise of social media, if you have like 1 million followers, right, it's almost guaranteed that like at least a handful of these people have erotomania with you as their obsession. It actually occurs more often in women than in men. It's just that men will more likely act violently as a result of having it. So when you see something on the news, you know, it's usually a man. Autophasia. This condition is also known as body integrity identity disorder, and it's where you have the need to amputate one of your healthy limbs. Autophasia is quite different from Munchousins, because even though both of them involve self-injurious behaviors, Munchousins is done because you want to have attention from other people, and generally after you have one, amputation, you'll probably want another one. It just keeps going because it's what you crave is attention rather than actually losing the limb. However, autophagia is different because it is a specific limb that you want to have amputated, and once you do have it amputated, you kind of don't have the need to do that anymore. So it's kind of a one and done. This condition is more neurological than psychological, with the brain kind of not really recognizing that limb. Like if I sprouted a hand out of the middle of my back, my brain would want me to get rid of that because it's not what it thinks my body should be like. People with the condition will often feel extreme discomfort when they're forced to use the limb that they believe shouldn't be there. It could even be something as like the wind brushes the back of your hand and now all of a sudden it feels like, you've got an extra hand, and it just has like, it's often described as this inscratchable itch that you just can't get rid of. People with this condition, when they're alone, will avoid using that limb, so they might wrap up their leg so it appears like it's been amputated and move along on crutches, which is also one of the reasons why it differentiates from Munchousins, because this is done in the privacy of your home, while if you have Munchousins, you're not going to do that when you're alone, but you're going to do it in front of other people. It must be noted that in some cases, there is a sexual component to this, in which people become aroused at the thought of losing their limb or aroused by the thought of other amputees. However, it isn't a purely sexual thing because there is this kind of idea that the limb isn't yours still. And in most cases, there isn't a sexual element. I just thought I should mention it because, it's a part of the condition in a lot of cases. The thing that makes this condition quite interesting to me is that it raises a lot of ethical questions, because there are therapies in which you can reduce the symptoms, but the most effective way to appease someone's Aonophilia is by removing the affective limb. Because of that, like, should doctors be allowed to just amputate a healthy limb if there's nothing physically wrong with it? And I just don't know. Like, I feel like I could be convinced of either way. Like, yeah, I just don't know. Like, should you be allowed to do that? Because at the end of the day, it's your body. But if you willingly make yourself disabled, there are like government programs that could help with that. For example, like, you know, like disability support and, you know, even just like a disabled parking spot. You know, it is just a weird thing that I've never really thought of before. And I actually don't know where I land on it, but I guess everyone's got their own opinions. Tier 4, Kotards Delusion. Kotards Delusion is a belief that you yourself are dead. It is like other delusions in the fact that despite the overwhelming evidence that you're alive, you will believe that you're dead regardless. It's also not limited just to thinking you're dead, but also you may believe that you just had never have existed, or that all your organs have been removed and are no longer inside your body. In one case, a woman with the delusion was repeatedly asking her family to take her to the morgue so she can be with the other dead bodies. And in a more interesting case, a man got really angry at one of his friends because his friend didn't go to his funeral. This condition can be quite dangerous because if you believe you're dead and you have no organs, then why would you eat or drink? So people with this condition will often starve themselves, and as a result, it becomes quite dangerous and they lose a lot of weight. Once again, Kotards delusion itself is not in the DSM, but is classified under other delusional disorders. The condition is often curable, and treatment for it consists mainly of antipsychotic medications, sometimes talk therapies, and in some cases it can also be electroconvulsive therapy, in which areas of the brain are stimulated with electricity, which changes the chemical composition and reduces the delusions. Kotards delusion is incredibly rare, with only around 200 cases ever being reported. It is likely way more common than that. Because it is just kind of wrapped up as a delusion, it's more likely to be attributed to some other more diagnosable condition. Therefore, you know, it's hard to tell the exact numbers and how likely it is for someone to develop the condition. Zoanthropy. Zoanthropy is the condition in which someone becomes convinced that they've turned into an animal. People with this condition will adopt the characteristics of their selected animal. A most notable one would be someone who thinks they've turned into a cow, which will then go out into a field and start chewing grass, or people will try and talk to them and all they'll do is moo. I was raised religious, right? And so whenever I hear of conditions like this, I think of stories from the Bible. There was one story in Daniel where the king, I think it was Nebuchadnezzar II, he disobeyed God in some way and he was punished. And his punishment included him kind of losing his mind and then going out into a field and adopting the characteristics of cattle, where I think his like fingernails grew quite long and he was like eating grass, and it said that he turned into a wild animal. It kind of makes me think, I wonder how many mental illnesses and delusions have resulted in what a lot of people have as religious beliefs, or kind of where a lot of spirituality might have come from, is just people experiencing these disorders. There's no way of knowing if, you know, King Nebuchadnezzar was actually experiencing some kind of zoanthropy. I just think it's quite interesting, and I choose to believe that he was. Zoanthropy is incredibly rare, with it being, I think, around 56 cases being reported since the mid-19th century. So that's like roughly 1 every 3 years. So this one is very niche. But interesting nonetheless. Fragali Syndrome. Fragali Syndrome is a rarer version of Capgrass Syndrome, where in Capgrass Syndrome you believe that people you know have been replaced by imposters. Fragali Syndrome is the opposite, in which they believe that every stranger they meet is someone they know in disguise. The syndrome gets its name from Leopoldo Fragali, who was an Italian actor who was very known for his impersonations and his ability to mimic famous people. The condition is a little bit broader than just kind of thinking everyone is someone you know in disguise. People with it will often confuse foreign locations for places they know. So an instance of this might be, they might be in the hospital and all of a sudden they think it's their bedroom. Stuff like that. This condition is also super rare, with only about 100 cases being documented in the last 200 years. And it's usually associated with some kind of neurological decay, as it is most often seen in people with dementia. Just like Capgrass Syndrome, people with this disorder can be quite violent as a result. But then again, it really depends on who they think everyone has been replaced with. For example, if they think someone has been replaced by like a family member or a close friend, then they feel quite like looked after and taken care of. But on the other side, if they think everyone's been replaced by someone who's out to get them, or like someone who's done them wrong before, they get quite, agitated. It also doesn't help that they feel that everyone is trying to trick them because they think everyone's in disguise, and so they'll accuse someone of being someone, and obviously you can't take off your disguise. Due to this condition being the result of dementia most of the time, it is very, very difficult to cure. But there is some success with antipsychotic medication, but it is quite small, and most of the time people will die with this condition. Extreme autophagia. This will be our final entry on the iceberg, and it is quite possibly the most brutal. So autophagia is a condition in which you have a compulsion to eat parts of your own body. In its mildest forms, this is usually something like fingernails or hair or like scabs. But in its more extreme cases, it will be things like chunks of flesh and whole fingers. So it can be quite gruesome. Needless to say, eating yourself is bad for your health, and usually it's done so in a manner that's not particularly sanitary. So people who with the disorder will generally get infections, and people have died as a result of that. People with autophagia tend to fall into two camps. In camp one, it's done because they're using pain as a way of emotional regulation. People in camp two tend to do it because there is some form of delusion that is informing their decisions, such as a voice in their head that is telling them that they must consume their own flesh or they're gonna die. Because of this, treatment varies depending on what camp they fall into, whether that be teaching them more healthy coping mechanisms or giving them some sort of antipsychotic medication. It's very hard to tell you the exact prevalence of this disorder, because it is treated more so as a symptom, and the umbrella of what is considered autophagia is quite broad. So for example, two people might be considered as having it, where one person is just nibbling at their fingertips, while the other person is gnawing huge chunks of flesh out of their leg, where they're not really comparable, but they're kind of treated as the same thing. But in these extreme cases in which they are eating significant chunks of themselves, it is almost impossibly rare, with only like a few cases ever properly documented. Sorry, I forgot to record a outro to this video. But anyway, this was my first video on this channel. So if you wouldn't mind dropping a like or subscribing, it would really go a long way. And I appreciate you sticking out this far, and I'll see you in the next one.